Hi folks, this is David Birchall. I'm presenting the lecture pods this week for Australian Politics and Active Citizenship in Spring 2020. This week's topic, as you'll be aware, is Australia's political parties, and I've produced two pods. This is the first one, about what are parties and where do they come from, and the second pod, which follow, and you'll find on the view site right beneath this one, talks about the history of our particular political parties and also the idea of a political spectrum. On the right hand side of the screen there, on the left hand side, obviously you can see the content of this first pod and the second one as well. On the right hand side, some moments in the history of Australia's longest lasting political party. The big black and white picture there is Ben Chifley, who was Labor Party leader in the late 1940s, speaking to a crowd in rural New South Wales, I think, around about the same time in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And you can see that's how politicians did it in those days. They stood out in the street and they spoke without microphones. Middle picture, you might recall this guy who died only recently, Bob Hawke, arguably Australian Labor's most successful leader. And there you can see he's still kind of doing the same thing on the hustings in the 1980s. I think that's when Labor was elected to power in 1983, and I'm imagining that is in suburban Melbourne. And bottom right-hand corner, you can see the ill-fated Labor Prime Minister Julia Gillard some years ago with that old-fashioned and, by this time, rather creaky ritual of kissing somebody else's baby. I was trained as an historian, and I like to think that the history of things tells you something about how they are now. So this first PowerPoint frame is about that. We think that political parties must have been around for a long time. They're more recent than we think. In most countries, they're no older than the 19th century. There were no political parties in ancient Greece in their democracy. Democracy was organised around individuals rather than parties or ideas, but again, not around parties. Parties are a production of modern representative democratic political systems. You don't find them, generally speaking, in ancient direct democracies. Top right hand corner there, that is another of the illustrations from William Hogarth's wonderful 1750s series on an election in 18th century Britain, and that's a pre-election party of the local candidate for the Whig Party. That's the orange flag there, the Whigs, in the 1750s in England, in what we would call a quite corrupt political system, where the candidates would ply their potential voters and all their hangers-ons and friends with food and alcohol and then send them out to vote. You all may think that's a great system, but it's actually kind of illegal now. So the first political parties, this is the point of that picture, did spring up in Britain in the early 18th century in the aftermath of enormous religious and political conflicts in the 17th century, the civil wars and the so-called Glorious Revolution of the late 17th century. So the parties originally merged out of those conflicts, both political and religious, but over time they were reshaped into something that looked like political parties we know today. Initially, the Tory party, which became the Conservative Party, stood by the monarchy, understanding it to be a force of tradition and stability, and with the established Anglican Church, whereas the Whigs, who saw themselves as kind of radical anti-establishment types at the time, stood for Parliament against monarchy and for religious dissent of different kinds, which means they belonged to religious groupings outside the established church. These divisions were quite bitter. We forget how bitter they were in the 18th century, no less bitter than today, possibly more so. It's a phrase coined in the early 1700s, the rage of party, sort of jokes that you couldn't stay in any inn in England without checking whether or not the innkeeper was a Tory or a Whig first. Over the 19th century, in the British political system, and also by derivation in ours as well, party labels started to shift. In Britain, the Whigs became the Liberals and the Tories became the Conservatives. And so what we might call political ideologies clustered around the parties, which to some extent became vehicles for ideological beliefs about how society and politics should be organised. Worth stressing this next point, because we tend to forget it. What we call the two-party system was not part of the constitution. The parties emerged, in a sense, accidentally as an historical byproduct of representative elections, the elections of representatives who grouped together into these parties. And then party allegiances were passed down often from parents to children. And that was still extremely common in Australia in the mid-20th century. We forget to what extent that was true, much less so today. Many of the same traditions sprang up in colonial Australia, although they were never exactly the same here, for reasons too complicated to explain. The liberal tradition was much stronger in Australia, the conservative tradition weaker. In Australia, economic debates about Australia's place in the world, and particularly free trade and protection, were often the most important dividing lines, more so actually than in Britain, and dividing the spectrum differently to the way it was divided in Britain as well. Take too long to explain, not going to do it here. So the Australian system was similar, but also different in significant respects. What was similar was the organisation of voting and elections around key political parties, the major political parties, if you like, and the emergence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries of Labour parties in Britain and in Australia, which had not existed in the 19th century, really emerging only with the extension of the franchise to include all adults. That's what saw the emergence of those styles of political parties. What do parties do? Well, as I said already, there's no mention of parties in the Australian Constitution, nor is there a mention of the person called a Prime Minister, by the way, nor are parties institutionalised in the Constitution of the United States, and the names of the parties there have changed also over time. And in the unwritten Constitution of Great Britain and the United Kingdom, there's no mention of no traditional understanding of the parties being part of the system. So when we talk about a party system or a two-party system, we are really inventing something that does not really exist. Nor is there any rule in the Australian Constitution or the United States one or the British Constitution or most other countries that says that there should be two parties that dominate the spectrum or dominate the news cycles. This has arisen as a matter of tradition, and political scientists, I don't think, can ever actually agree upon exactly why and how that is. It's not true in every country in the world. It's true in the, as they used to be called, the English-speaking democracies. It's true in a lot of other countries, but not all. In practice, though they're not entrenched in the Constitution, political parties seem to help make representative democracy function in practical ways. You don't have to like them, but they seem to work in practical ways to facilitate representative democracy. Meaning democracy through a system of parliamentary representation. They manage public participation in politics through defined party processes. People join political parties, they, amongst other things, vote for the representatives who get elected to Parliament, for them to be pre-selected to stand for those seats. And they in turn then also had the ability to stand themselves. So the parties funnel participation in important ways. They have all sorts of rules around membership, as I've said, also pre-selection, which organise political argument and debate, not in ways, as I say, that are legal, in the way that I suppose you could say that voluntary associations also structure the activities that they're concerned with, such as local sporting clubs, charities and welfare associations, things like that. Institutions of that kind don't have to be legally institutionalised to serve purposes that make them effective. Also, historically speaking, this, what we like to call the two-party system, has organised debate, political debate, around poles, what one could call, if you like, the centre-right of the spectrum and the centre-left of the spectrum, and by the same token around ideological viewpoints, if you like, conservative viewpoints on the social right and social democratic, or in some countries, liberal ideologies on the centre-left. There are other party systems which don't work that way, which organise the party system along different lines. Ireland is a famous example, which is a bit more like Australia in the early 20th century, where the argument's more about economic policy in a narrow sense and and honest economic position in the world, and have very little to do with debates about socialism or social democracy. Or parts of South America where populist political parties that don't obviously belong to either the right or the left have often been extremely effective. The identities of the major parties in Australia, like most countries, have changed over time, as have the issues which have defined them. Back in 1901, at the time of Federation, the major issues defining the parties usually were to do with trade and protection of domestic industry. Later on, the issue of collective rights, say people's rights in relation to their participation in the trade union movement, as opposed to the rights of individuals and consumers, became a major dividing line of controversy in Australian politics. More recently, we've seen issues, if you like, which you could call social issues. Not that those other issues weren't, they were social as well, but issues we call social issues around gender, the environment, race, identity, all those sorts of questions, have reshaped the spectrum, and the parties have tended to reshape themselves at the same time. And the cause and effect there is something I think political scientists are still struggling to understand. Okay, so the last two PowerPoints here are really just thinking about the way this ideological grappling has shifted over the course of the last 120 years since Federation. In the first federal parliament of 1901, Labor emerged for the first time as a significant player in Australian political affairs and disrupted what was then the two-party system, which had been organised around protectionism versus free trade. Labor's emergence reorganised the political debate and also reorganised the party debate, since it emerged and replaced some of the earlier liberal parties in Australian politics. Labor's emergence in Australia was unprecedented in the world, really. Labor parties emerged around Australia in the 1890s, and in the years before World War I, Labor was already forming governments. There's not a single example of that speed of that rise in another Western or even non-Western country, actually. Perhaps the most famous, or one of the most famous of the early Australian Prime Ministers, top right-hand corner there, was John Curtin, who was Australia's Prime Minister through the great bulk of our participation in World War II and died rather tragically at the end of it. Labor is the only party to have contested with success every election since 1901. So it's the only continuous political party in Australian politics. On the centre-right of the spectrum, there have been a series of political parties. The most famous before World War II was the United Australia Party, but it had a number of different predecessors who often had anti-socialist dispositions organising their outlook. During World War II, Robert Menzies, bottom right-hand corner there, founded the Liberal Party, which became the major centre-right party in Australia up into and including the present day. He called it the Liberal Party, which confuses people in other countries, since in America, for instance, liberalism tends to be associated as an idea with the centre-left. But he was attempting, so he told us later in his memoirs, to meld together the economic individualism of traditional centre-right politics of different kinds with what he saw as a sort of social liberalism, to create a sort of more centralist conservatism than in some countries. At least that was what he claimed. The Conservative parties, for much of Australian democracy from the 1930s up until the 1980s, prided themselves on governing competence and spent a lot of time attempting to discredit the Labor Party on the basis of it being incompetent or inept or internally divided. And also after World War II, Robert Menzies, who was an extremely artful politician, made much of Labor's supposed links to socialism, and especially to the Labor left to the socialist Soviet Union. We forget it now, I think, but in the 1950s and 1960s, Australian politics was as bitterly divided as it has ever been, and probably more so than today. Labor's fortunes as a party peaked during the Second World War, with the creation of a welfare state under the conditions of wartime, the extension of the taxation powers of the federal governments by the connivance of the the High Court, and also the creation of the Australian alliance under the Prime Ministership of John Curtin, who shifted our primary military alliance out of necessity from Britain to the United States when we were under threat in 1942. Labor was overwhelmingly associated for most of this period with the protection of domestic industry and with limiting the amount of immigration. Labor was closely associated with the White Australia policy, although the White Australia policy was a bipartisan policy. But gradually, both parties moved away from, party groupings moved away from it in the decades after World War II, when it was clearly necessary for pragmatic reasons, aside from many other ones, for Australia to have much higher levels of immigration to rebuild the country and build up its infrastructure, such as the Snowy Mountains scheme in the 1950s. Up until the 1970s, both sides of politics were, broadly speaking, protectionist. They attempted to keep out foreign products, or at least to price them more highly, so as to protect Australian industry. So there were deep ideological divisions, but also a lot of commonality. Since the early 1970s, the parties have changed. Labor has probably changed more obviously and visibly than the Conservative parties. When Gough Whitlam, obviously holding the drink there, top right-hand corner, the guy on the left, when he assumed the Labor leadership and became Prime Minister later in the early 1970s, he attempted to reshape Labor in what he thought of as a modernising direction, more as, if you like, a progressive party, and less as a kind of socialistic party as it had previously been understood. He focused more on social issues and what were thought at the time new social issues: multiculturalism, Indigenous issues, the rights of women, the environment. That created some tensions with parts of Labor's older constituencies, and it involved tensions between different wings of the Labor Party as well, between the trade union wing at times and other wings. But nevertheless, that has been the general course of Labor since the early 1970s. And from the 1980s through the 1990s, Labor also made another startling shift, although Whitlam had also moved Labor in that direction. Labor moved away from its traditional association with economic protection and protection of local manufacturing, and moved the economy into much more free trade, globalised direction, again with some tensions internally within the Labor movement and the party. You'll be aware that from the mid-1990s, after a long period of Labor rule in the 1980s and through the mid-1990s, from the mid-1990s onwards, the bulk of Australian governance has been conducted by the Conservative parties, who presented themselves, again generally speaking, as forces of tradition and stability and small government and low taxes, none of which is actually new, although sometimes the rhetoric has been stronger than previously, and also a focus on border protection and national identity, which were also there in the past but perhaps not as strong. Where Labor was relatively briefly in power in the 21st century was in the prime ministerships of Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, pictured there looking awkwardly rubbing elbows in the last federal election campaign. That was Labor's high point there, was again at a time of kind of sort of small-scale national crisis, the global financial crisis. Since then, Labor has struggled, I think, firstly to form government, and secondly to reshape its identity one more time, given that climate and environmental issues have tended to become dominant in recent years, but they are issues that play different ways in terms of Labor's traditional constituencies and the different voting blocs who've tended to keep Labor in power. On to the next pod.